I should send her another one. Send her another one. Can you slide forward a little bit?
Yep. A little distant there.
That's a great. It just stopped.
Yeah.
Froze
Stay
right
there.
on that.
You're looking for Wi-Fi. It really is weird and intermittent.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Is Bob frozen on your screen? Can you see him?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you.
Oh, okay.
You don't even see him frozen on.
No, I see your picture, David. That's your like profile picture or whatever. You still there?
This must be. Okay.
Hello.
Hey, Amy.
Hello. Yeah.
All right. Let me switch to the regular camera.
Nope.
Yeah, we're switching cameras.
Okay.
Hey, Aaron got.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you close to?
Yeah, I'm reviewing it again. It's good luck. It's fine. It's just so jargony and.
Oh.
And
Okay, you're sort of coming up now, although it's really, really grainy.
It's really grainy. Okay, I'll record it here just to be safe because you're pretty grainy too. I think the Wi-Fi in here is just kind of intermittent, but I'm doing a screen capture too, so.
Okay.
See me.
All right, it
A little lag, but
it went away and now it's back. Can you see us?
I can now. There was like a weird pause.
Oh, that's weird.
I never know where to look.
yeah, well, it's always unsettling when you look at the camera. We're just like, hi,
Are you looking
I
at
did this.
So I don't think we're going to use that camera. I don't. For some reason, that's.
Oh, this camera.
It doesn't like that feed. So.
This is the one I was looking slightly up, which is even weirder. If I'm looking down, it's less because if I'm looking at you, it's like this status thing. If I'm looking down, well, also it looks like I'm working, so I could be working on my keyboard right now. Yeah, right like this.
A little closer, yeah.
Yeah. Use the forced perspective thing on my hands, so it's like, like Hobbit feet, like Gandalf in the foreground. These are my pet squids. Ready and active.
Yeah, I'll just. See if I can hide this.
You're a little.
From broadcast. Oh, I think it ended up muting her.
Oh.
Show and broadcast. That's okay.
I still got the icon, the mute icon.
Okay.
Oh,
okay, yeah, there we go. I think
it's clearer now. It got better.
Yeah, there's less lag here too.
Okay, let me see if this goes away. It's like it looks like you got a Vine loop going on, Bob. All right, that's ridiculous.
Resist the temptation and move your chair.
Right. I know it's a bad choice. Oh well.
I think we're good. You guys ready?
Yeah. Are we recording?
We're recording.
Oh, okay, good.
This will be all the outtakes. We're good. Door shut. Yep.
Okay. Do you have your phone, by the way?
I don't.
Okay, good. I was gonna say if you actually, I need to turn mine off.
Yep, that's what I was about to do, and then I realized I left it in the other room. So.
Okay. Yeah, Emily got a call in the middle of our discussion. So.
Yeah, I can.
But it was on vibrate, but you could still kind of hear it. So. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So I want to start out by just having you talk a little bit about what you're doing in the Maker Journalism class and kind of your thoughts on the opportunities for kind of the maker ethos for journalism.
Sure. We have a Maker Journalism class. It's officially called the Sensor Journalism class, but that's a little bit actually more limited than it needs to be. We do deal with sensors. We deal with primarily the Arduino, which is a microcontroller, and can be wired up into circuits that use things like temperature sensors, dust particulate sensors, decibel sensors, any kind of environmental element that can be tracked. We can get the parts to wire up to an Arduino. And so we've done that. The students' projects as a whole this semester were to use the temperature sensors that they all have with their starter kits and use these to come up with projects that could be tracked on campus. The rules were the projects had to be on campus and they had to be indoors because we're not quite sure how hardy these are standing up to the elements outside. And that was one project we came up with from a sensor that everybody in my class had. But ideally, and in future iterations of the class, we'd like to expand that to all varieties of sensing. Now that we've got a semester under our belt, we've got a clear idea about how to go about asking detection and sensing type questions. And I say it's the Maker Journalism is a more accurate title for the class because we've bookended the class, the meat of the sandwich of the class, which is working with those Arduino sensors. We've bookended that with far more lo-fi projects. So at the beginning of the semester, one of our first projects was every student had to come in with something that they had made. And it couldn't be a cop-out, such as something they had just learned how to make online. It had to be something they knew how to make. So we had students, and they were often surprised that they knew how to make things they took for granted. We had students that knew how to knit, so they would bring in projects for that. We had one student who blew a shoelace on his boots a couple days before, and he made his own shoelaces out of duct tape. And he came in with those, and he showed us how to make those. We had students that baked some things. We had one student that made his own skateboard. We had a student that was with the scene shop. But the thinking with that, and then what they had to do was put together a how-to video for how to make the thing that they were kind of an expert in. And the thinking with that is to get students into the mindset that this is not a class about electronics or a class about coding, but rather a class about how to use the idea of making, the confidence required to make something, and the satisfaction that's imparted from make something to get at journalistic type questions. And we started with that kind of lo-fi angle. And we ended with basically a science fair where they took their projects, their temperature sensing projects, and had to come up with stand-ups that showed what they did. And we were right back to the glue and ink and paper and cutting things out stage of Maker Journalism. The whole point is to teach confidence and the courage to go in and mess around with stuff as much as it is to learn specifically about coding or electrical design.
So what, when you think about just the bigger picture of maker journalism, what kind of opportunities do you see out there for people going into the field?
Well, the great thing about it is there's so many projects, traditional journalistic projects, that deal with data that could be better sensed via computers rather than via human. Temperature sensing is such a great example because I can go and I can record the temperature every hour, or I can, or every half hour, or the barometric pressure, or some environmental detail, and I can do that, and it'll probably be decent. But there's a lot of factors that go into messing things up. There's human error. I might misread the thermometer, or I might sleep through the 1 a.m. Time slot, or that kind of thing. With the computer, with the microcontroller, with that kind of sensing, I can turn the thing on and let it record over a span of 24 hours or 48 hours or a week or whatever, and then I can take that data and I can apply human thought to it. So essentially what's great about this and what's translatable to wherever students wind up is we're letting computers do what computers do best, and we're letting humans do what humans do best. And now these students all have their sensors. That's one of the, instead of a textbook, they're required to buy an Arduino starter kit for the class. They can take that to whatever newspaper they start off with. They start off at a 5,000 circulation newspaper. They can tell their editor, hey, I can do this story involving temperature sensing or noise pollution sensing, and I've already got the equipment for it. And free is music to most editors' ears.
So from a bigger picture though standpoint for sort of the industry, what kind of opportunities do you see out there in different story forms and all of those sorts of things as people kind of learn to experiment a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're so focused on data right now, and a lot of our data comes from counting people or dealing with survey data, which is human-reported data, and we're becoming very data savvy, and yet what sensors provide the opportunity to get at is something we don't have as much of, which is, again, environmental data. And not that we haven't done temperature, weather stories, things like that in the past, but this provides a very accessible means for telling that kind of story that's fundamental to journalism, and that ties in with this focus on data that we have right now, but gets away from data that's about humans and gets into data about environment, about the environment in which we live, be it sensing pollution or light or whatever it is. So it adds on to a skill set that we're already seeing the value of by adding the means to acquire more data than we were able to acquire before, at least not without complex and expensive sensors. With an Arduino, with a microcontroller, you can get this kind of data pretty economically.
When you're working with students or anybody really who's not familiar with the electronics, there can be sort of an intimidation factor, right? About, I'm not an engineer, or, these things are sort of foreign to me. So how can you, how do you think about and how do you try to convey that these things are more accessible, and how can we make them maybe even more accessible in a larger standpoint?
Well, I always try to emphasize first when talking to people about the class that these students have typically no coding experience, no electrical experience, no electronics experience, and that's important, and that's why we use the starting materials that we do, because it's very user-friendly. And what I try to emphasize as well, which I'll be able to do less in future years, is that I have very little experience with this. And what I will often say, I think to my dean's dismay, is that I have no idea what I'm doing. And I mean that in the best possible way, in the sense that I am new to this. I am, in some cases, a couple months, maybe even a couple weeks only ahead of my students. I am learning this as I go along. This is a new area for me as a journalist. And it's important to me to be able to say that, because it shows my student, yeah, I'm not that far away from where you are at in terms of lack of experience, in terms of intimidation level. And I've messed a lot of things up, and my students have messed a lot of things up. And what we try to be very clear about is that it's okay to mess things up, because you don't know everything about how all this works. You just need to learn enough. And that's a big part of journalism as a whole, whether you're dealing with sensors or not, is the ability to learn enough to tell a story. So my students will go in and we'll have a sketch. As an example, we had a sketch where we took a little buzzer that could play a song. The default code was to play a song. It was Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. And they had to get into that code. They could not have written that script. What they had to do for their assignment, though, was to get into the code and identify the parts that played the song and change them to play a different song. Now, these students could not have written that sketch, but what they all came back with were songs of their own. They weren't all great songs, but they were all able to come back with songs of their own. And why that's such a great example for this class is because it shows not that they're master coders, but that they've developed the courage and the confidence to go in and learn enough about code to change it to get what they want. And that's what we're getting at. So the intimidation factor is the hardest thing to unlearn, which is why we encourage them to go in and break it, to mess with things, because we can always go back to the default. It's never irreparably fixed or never irreparably damaged. They can always go in and change things and see what they can make it do differently. And so the lack of experience is good because they haven't come in with preconceived notions about what they can't do.
So, kind of getting at the bigger idea of intimidation, but also sort of why is it so important for them to learn to get over that? Why is it important for them to be able to essentially fail?
Right. No, it's very important, and I would say for all journalists, it's very important right now, because right now journalists don't get to just be a writer anymore. They don't get to just be a photographer anymore, and that's frustrating to a lot of journalists that are already out there, and it's frustrating to a lot of students, because the idea they have about journalism is, I'm just going to be a writer. I'm going to be this thing. And you don't get to just be a thing anymore. And so getting over that intimidation factor, even if they never work with a censor again, messing around with something that they are not familiar with and getting it to do something that can be translated into journalism, like temperature data or whatever, is excellent experience for getting out of that just box, for getting out of that box of like, no, this is what I do. I love the idea that I had 12 students this semester, and I love the idea that I now have 12 people who are not necessarily going to be programmers, or are not necessarily going to be censor journalists or data journalists, but I do have 12 people who say I can do that thing. That thing doesn't define me. In fact, I hope they don't define themselves as one thing anymore. But they've learned that whatever they conceived of themselves as before now includes this thing that wasn't part of that before. And the more weird things they have to do, the less they're going to bind themselves to a specific identity as this type of reporter. The more willing they're going to be to take chances, and the more able they're going to be to identify stories in non-traditional places.
So beyond just for students, though, if there are professional journalists out there who are thinking about, trying to diversify their skills and whatnot, why do you think that this kind of thing can be empowering for them?
I would say for absolutely the same reasons, especially if you're a traditional journalist and you've been in the career for a while, and you might feel perhaps my job's at risk, or perhaps I'm not telling the kind of stories that are getting views, that are telling the full story anymore. We have more capabilities of telling a greater range of stories now. By forcing yourself to learn something new, you are forcing yourself to get out of the box of, I can only be this thing. Because journalists are the best generalists in the world. Good journalists are the best at learning about as many things as possible. It's why I love journalism, because the field is based on learning everything you can about something you don't know about, and then next week learning something about entirely different. To force yourself to use something like censors to tell the kind of stories you're used to telling, but with new information, with new data, with new resources, forces you out of the box of thinking, I can only do this thing. Because every journalist, it's what makes you a journalist. Every journalist is the kind of person that is able to pick up a variety of skills, a variety of knowledge, a variety of small expertises that can be used to tell some complex story to an audience that wouldn't understand it without you. So learning a new skill, whether it's Arduino, or whether it's video recording, or making graphics, or whatever, helps you out of that I just do this box. And it's going to make you more competitive in the marketplace, and it's going to help you to tell better stories. I talk about students, but I love doing workshops with adults as well, because people's eyes light up when they make something. I have taught censors to kindergartners this semester, and I have taught censors to professionals, university administrators, people from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, people with far more experience than I am, and the reaction is always the same. As soon as you make something, your eyes light up because you've just realized that you've entered into a new world of possibility. And that's what's so cool about doing this.
So on the flip side, what do you see as sort of maybe some of the perils to censor journalism or using electronics and those sorts of things? What are the things that people need to keep in mind to make sure that we're not just kind of going after that new shiny object?
Sure, and one of the things about data, whether it's from censors or poll data or whatever, is working with data requires data literacy. And I see this with students, and I see this with professionals. The idea that, well, I've got this spreadsheet, what's my story? And at worst, we can fall short there because we don't think beyond the acquisition of the data. And remember, I gave the example before that the great thing about censors is it allows computers to do what computers do well and humans to do what humans do well. We can't leave out the human part of that equation because computers are excellent, censors are excellent at recording data, but they're rubbish at making sense of that data. That's not what they do. They don't have human brains. It's our job to look at that and filter out the noise and look at the false positives and weed out the things that just aren't useful to tell an actual story. So it's not enough to say, well, I've got this Arduino and sit it on a table and expect that it's going to do journalism for you. It is a tool, just like a pen is a tool, just like a computer is a tool to help you towards journalism. So the biggest shortfall we can run into with these censors is thinking that censor equals journalism. All a censor is a tool. Everything is a tool. Blogs are a tool. Social media is tools. Like I said, pens and pencils are tools. What we need to be clear on is what we do with what we gather from those tools. If we don't learn data literacy, those sensors aren't worth very much.
So talk a little bit more about data literacy and what that means.
Mm-hmm. Well, data literacy is the ability to look at data and identify, well, data literacy has two components, two directions I would say it takes. There's the ability to ask a question that requires data to answer, and there's the ability to take existing data and identify what questions can be answered with it. And those are two different but complementary skills. So if you've got a question, if you've had experience with sensors, if you have experience with forms of data acquisition, search engines, whatever, then that's a tool you can use to answer that question that you couldn't if you didn't have that experience. On the other hand, if somebody dumps a spreadsheet on your lap that's got 3,000 plus entries in it, it's gonna, if you're not data literate, if you don't know how to ask questions of that data is worthless to you. It might as well be written in a language you don't speak. It effectively is written in a language you don't speak. And so learning how to ask the right questions that lead to data and learning how to ask questions of data that you already have is vital to making sense of, well, data, is vital to data being useful to the journalist. And that requires some training. That requires some trial and error. That requires some first stories that might, frankly, be lousy. And that's okay, because that's where we start, is by figuring out, do we have enough temperature data to make a conclusion about the things we've tracked? And you might not. One of the things my students found in their class of tracking temperature data is that going to a class, one of my student groups went to rec center workout classes to track data, and went to each class one time. And what they found was that's not really enough data to draw a conclusion about what that class is like. You just measured it once. And that was a learning experience for them. Finding out that just walking in once, saying, okay, I tracked it, and going home does not end your commitment to acquiring data. Because it could have been a warm day. There could have been fewer people than usual in the class. There's so many factors that go in. And so doing it and screwing up is one of the first ways to learn how to become more literate about what data needs to be meaningful to an audience.
Do you think that there are any sort of ethical concerns when collecting data?
Certainly, and it depends on the kind of data that's been collected. In terms of the law, a lot of the time we're safe, because data is publicly available information. So in the sense of recording the temperature, in terms of recording the number of people that tweeted to a certain hashtag, things like that, it's publicly available. You're on perfectly good legal ground. Just because it's legal, however, doesn't necessarily satisfy the ethical question. Many things are legal that a good journalist needs to stop and think very hard about. The example I gave with the students tracking temperature in rec center classes is a great example. The temperature in a rec center workout class is not proprietary. There's no privacy information involved with that. That's all fair game, but for those students to record that data, they need to get permission from the instructor of the class. They need to get permission from the people involved in the class to be sitting in their classroom with a computer recording information while people jumped up and down and worked out and sweated in relatively skimpy outfits. That's something, even though my students might know that all they're tracking is temperature data, a ethical data journalist would be sure that the people involved know what's being tracked, what's not being tracked, and would know that they feel safe. Because frankly, we're in an environment where if we don't want our sensors, we don't want people shooting our drones out of the sky and outlawing our sensors. We need to be proactive in being sure that the sensors we use to collect data are transparent, are above ground, and we are as clear as possible about what they're collecting, what they do not collect, and what they cannot collect. This way, we don't foster an environment of mistrust of these sensors. We teach people right from the get-go. We don't wait until they don't trust us and then come back. We teach people right from the get-go that what we do is collect information, not about them, but about the environment, that we are not attempting to be intrusive or invasive. And that's a lot of work that we need to put on the front end, or we will pay for it later. We need to be very clear about what we're sensing, what we're not, and that your privacy is being protected whenever possible.
So how would you suggest, for example, like a student walking into the rec center or a student going to like a residential housing, right? How would you did you have those conversations with them ahead of time to explain, like, this is how you need to be transparent about what you're doing? You know, what are those conversations like, and what are the things that they need to think about when anybody, students or professionals, whoever, are using these things? How should they be communicating that information to sort of the public?
Yeah, we tried to talk about this as clearly as possible. And again, the Rec Center classes were the clearest example where we talked well beforehand about what needs to be said to people. Because again, if I was a woman in a workout class and somebody walks in with a big wired up recording device, yeah, I'd want to know what's going on. And so we try to make clear, at the very least, they're putting themselves in that position of how would you feel if somebody was doing this while you were there. Yes, in some of the cases, it's publicly available. It's a public space that anybody can walk into. And this is why we're talking about ethics rather than law. It's just a question of not, well, can I do this? Yes, you can. It is legal to do it with no trouble. But put yourself in the position of how would you feel if somebody walked in and appeared to be tracking something possibly about you. And so what we try to talk about is, when you're in a situation like that, talk to the person as you would like them to have spoken to you if you were in their position. One thing we're doing here, there's other concerns too, especially where we're at in the security-based state we're living in right now. There's concerns about what sensors look like. There are little collections of wires with blinking lights. We've been tracking usage of the Media Innovation Center here with a motion detector that some students wired together. And what we've not done yet that we need to work on is make clear via visual display what this device with a blinking light that you walk past when you walk into the building is. Because quite frankly, when I walk into a building and I walk past a device that's it's got wires and lights blinking all over it that is set in the hallway, my first thought is that thing going to harm me? And we need to work on ways to make that signage clear. I'd like to work with a 3D printing lab, for example, to make a big friendly container for it that says, hey, this isn't a bomb. Because this is the kind of thing you need to think about. We are hyper-attuned to both surveillance. And the possibility of electronics being used to harm us right now, and with good reason. And so we need to be clear about that and get beyond the mindset of, it's legal for us to do it, there's no problem. It's our building, we can record what we want, and become more empathetic to the users. And doing that means thinking about, what would I see if I was a parent, if I was a woman, if I was a potentially vulnerable party walking in proximity to this wired up device that I have no familiarity with. We can argue that that is making too much work for us. We can argue that that is treating people as being overly sensitive. But if we cultivate a positive environment for using these sensors as useful tools rather than just mysterious collection devices, we're going to do a lot more towards public goodwill, towards the kind of projects that are beneficial to the public.
Do you see some opportunities of actually working with sort of the greater community or with the public when it comes to detection and deploying sensors, for example? So it's one thing for the students or for professionals to go out and put sensors around to different places, but it's a whole other thing, and you would get more if you were able to sort of work with a community to have them be enlisted in this process. So what kind of opportunities do you see with enlisting the public?
That's the greatest strength that can be tapped for sensor projects, is enlisting the community for so many reasons. First of all, crowdsourced sensing. The classic example is WNYC's Cicada Tracker project, where people were told how to make simple sensors that tracked ground temperatures that told when a particular cicada brood was coming out. That project would not have been possible without thousands of people doing this project up and down the eastern seaboard. That's the classic example, and it's never been replicated to that extent, which is a shame, because that's the beautiful part of it. In addition to getting more data, which is totally self-serving, although it certainly serves the viewing or listening audience, it also serves the public in that goodwill sense. I'm far more predisposed to a journalistic project, to a sensing project that I've had a hand in. Once again, just like I talked about for workshops, people's faces light up when they've made something that does something. It can be as simple as making a badge whose eyes light up, or something as complex as making a sensor that tracks ideal cicada temperatures or that sort of thing. But it gets people involved, it gets people engaged, and it teaches them that these are interesting tools. These are helpful tools. These are tools that tell more stories. So there are so many good reasons and no bad ones that I can think of to incorporate the public, to incorporate crowdsourcing in censored journalism. It gets them involved with journalism. It gets you a wider range of data, and it encourages that goodwill toward the project by letting people say, look, you can build this yourself. It's not here to harm you. It's here to tell you more about the kind of stories that we can tell today.
So sensors are just one sort of part of the Internet of Things, and I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about the potential for other smart types of objects when it comes to journalism as a whole.
I mean, yeah, sensors are one part of it, but on the whole, the entire Internet of Things is based on detection and collection, and sensors do that by drawing it from the environment. But the whole idea of interneting yourself, that's not a verb, but of making yourself publicly available or of tracking your information for yourself. I mean, this is, Facebook is not a thing, but the idea of sharing really owes its origins to things like Facebook and MySpace and Friendster and going way back in time like that. And the Internet of Things ties into that muscle that we've developed in the last 10 years. And the idea of logging my runs with a widget on my shoe that I can then upload the results of to Facebook or Twitter or whatever is part of that. The idea of tracking data to be shared for my benefit in terms of my knowing what my running habits are, but also for the public benefit in terms of being able to aggregate data and know what our running habits are. So at its best, this whole Internet of Things leads to hopefully, will lead to a greater sense of community in the sense of we do these things together, and here's our data. Now, at worst, it certainly can lead to things like annoyance, information exhaustion, people saying, I don't care about your run, I don't care about how many such and such as you've done that have been tracked with the plastic widget you wear on you. And that's part of it too. I mean, it's a new thing, it's not going away, but there's certainly potential for fatigue in all this sharing of data that we have. But on the whole, and there are also concerns about how else tracked data is being used. It's one thing for me to track my runs. It's another thing for the company that provides the widget to track that and start using that data to produce ads in my feed that I didn't ask for and that sort of thing. So there's definite downsides to the data that comes from the things that we are slowly accumulating over time. The argument's been made that things are turning us into a kind of cyborg culture. Not as a good thing or a bad thing, but the idea being that we are augmenting ourselves with physical objects. Think of the guy with the Bluetooth headset right here that you think is talking to himself until you see him, or Google Glass, or Fitbits, or all those things that are not attached to our bodies yet, but might as well be. My smartphone is not attached to my body, but considering I don't ever leave home without it, and it's often in my hand, it might as well be. So the Internet of Things is physically changing our interaction with the world. We are starting to interact with the world more through objects other than ourselves. We are starting to think in terms of media writ large, not just media in the sense of television and newspapers and that sort of thing, but media in the sense of things that go between us and the immediate environment. There's both good sides and bad sides to that. You talked a little earlier about sort of the concerns about data privacy. I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper on that and sort of talk about, what your views are on making sure, again, in the role of a journalist, making sure that we're being respectful, but also trying to educate what it means when we're talking about data privacy. And I mean, you're talking about Fitbits, for example, and like what the companies are doing with that information, who owns the data, and all of those sorts of things. Yeah, and who owns the data? Often let's start with the legal. Who owns the data is often defined by what's in the agreement that you sign or click on or perhaps don't read when you first log into the Fitbit or the whatever. Now, some of those things get challenged in court, but we the consumers do have a responsibility to know what we're signing up for before we start using that new plastic gadget. That said, those agreements are long, and those agreements are complex, and those agreements are often written with an eye towards obscuring what exactly you're giving up. So we cannot put all that on the consumer. Now, I can't speak to the corporate side of things as a member of that community, but I can definitely speak to the journalistic side of it. What we can do, because we're not private organizations, what we must do is be as clear as possible about when data is being collected, what data is being used for, and how identifiable one is from that data. Because at the heart of privacy is always that aspect of who has control over my personal information. So, using data, we're not using temperature data or environmental data. If we're using data about humans, by its definition, it is attached to individuals. So we need to be as clear as possible, both in our recording and in our disclosure, what that data includes, both public and private. For example, there might be a reason to keep data files identifiable, even though the publicly available files are not. There may be reason to keep available what the individual users are. If that's the case, people need to know about it, because that's going to affect the decision about whether to contribute to whatever your project is. 1 second, I had a brain fart. Oh shoot, I had a thought and it slipped away from me. Data publicly available. Oh, yes, there we go. The other thing that the most data-oriented news publications do is make that data readily available. The idea being, I'm using your data. Let's say I'm acquiring your data on voting habits or preferences for something, and it's totally unidentifiable. There's nothing attached to it, either public or private, that could identify individuals for it. But that still doesn't mean it's solely mine, because without you, I wouldn't have that data. The best journalistic organizations that are heavy data users immediately make that data publicly available. The Guardian is a great example of this. When The Guardian does data journalism, you can access the entire data file, often in multiple formats, to do what you want with it, or just to look at it, just to go through that spreadsheet, or use it to create your own app or your own thing. Because what this acknowledges is it's not merely transparent of saying, here's the raw data. It's beneficent. It's saying, we wouldn't have this data without you. So this data is yours as much as it is ours. Even though we're the ones that collected it, the data wouldn't exist without your participation. And that's good data citizenship. When you acquire data from a public, even if you pay them, honestly, I would say, when you acquire data from a public, you owe it to that public to make that data transparently and fully available for them to do with what they will. Because it's not just your data. It wouldn't exist without you, but it wouldn't exist without them either. It's ours, and we should all have access to that data.
Tell me about all of this. Like, why did you get involved in this?
Why did I get involved with this? This?
Well, sort of the maker stuff.
Okay. Well, okay, my background is I started off as a reporter, and then the biggest part of my professional background before getting back into academia was in news design. I've always had an interest in visuals, always had an interest in visual communication, and that sort of thing. And so I gravitated to information graphics way back 10 or more years ago. Information graphics, charts, maps, diagrams has always been something I just really loved doing. And as I've progressed, what I found is an increasing value in visualization. This is a language that we as an audience speak more and more fluently. The millennial generation speaks information graphic far more fluently than the preceding generations have. It's just part of their feeds on social media. It's part of a language they're used to speaking. And so with visualization in mind, I got more to thinking about where those visuals come from. Those visuals come from data. They come from data acquired from surveys. They come from data acquired from polling data. They come from data acquired from the environment, sensing data. And everything flows from an interest in data visualization. So if I'm interested in data visualization, I got interested in where the data comes from. How to conduct the journalism that produces that data that can lead to better visualizations. As I've progressed and as the technology for things like Arduino and sensors have become more readily available and less expensive, that progressed as a natural offshoot of it. That if I can get data from surveys, polls, government voter rolls, things like that, now I have the means to also acquire data from the environment. Like I said before, temperatures, volume, whatever exists, we can now sense for relatively cheap. This is just more data to add to the pool to visualize more forms of stories, to tell people more about the world in which they live. More data in the sense of visualization is always a good thing because it leads to greater accuracy in the kind of stories we want to tell. So really, this is an extension of learning how to make charts way back in college. I've just got better tools to acquire the stuff that those charts come from.
So if you had to evangelize
Yes.
with someone in not even a student, what the best thing about all of this is, what would you say to them?
Best thing is being able to make stuff that does stuff. And that's way too general. But it's true. If you can make something that does a task for yourself, it's immediately satisfying, full stop, before you even get into the realm of journalism. If you can make something that does something and it's satisfying and it can also help you do your job, that's just icing on the cake. So every day you come to work and make something that helps you do your job is a good day, because you're working at two different levels. You're producing journalism, and you're also producing the thing that produces journalism. You can satisfy that need in all of us to construct, to build, to create at so many levels from this. And you can take from this not just personal gratification, but the ability to tell a greater range of richer, more detailed stories to a greater variety of audiences and interests out there. Every ability we have to gather information on a different level helps us to tell a more varied story. And at the end of the day, we want to be capturing the world as it exists in as much complexity as possible. The more tools we have, the better we can do that.
Anything you want to add to end?
Nah, learn to solder. Take a visualization class. There's free ones offered online as well as the fine ones we offer here at the Reed College of Media at WVU.
Learn how to make something. Pick up a copy of Make Magazine.
Make a snowball can. Make an automatic dog walker. Make something that does something. You'll get the bug, and you'll want to make something. You want to figure out what comes next.
Great.
Good.
Thank you. I'll come over in a second. And I think we have to stop it. Is
Okay.
David still around?
No, he's not in here.
Oh, I'll see if I can find him.
Okay. B-roll.
Hey, how'd it go?
Hey, good, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
ask her.
Yeah.